Hello, this is old Mr. Kent of MrKent.com, and if you're not familiar with my flying history, this is my favorite flying park, and I thought, well, I'll bring my new Mavic Air 2 over and introduce the two together, because I have spent a lot of time over the last 3.5 years flying around in this park. And what I'll do is I'll give you a tour. I'm not going to cut anything out, and I'm not going to speed anything up, and let you take a look at the park, while I also introduce you to old Mr. Kent's flying history, why I love to fly. And there you see I cranked up the brightness, but I'll be turning it back down here pretty soon. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a trip around this park and all of the things I love about it, and I'm going to introduce you to my flying history and why I love flying. So, to begin with, a good place to begin is I was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1942, just a couple of months after the Second World War was started. And my dad worked for United Airlines as a radio technician, and so, that kind of ties me to flying a little bit over the years. But my mom was a Rosie the Riveter. Now, if you don't know anything about Rosie the Riveter, back in the 1940s during the war, we had a different kind of a country back then, I think, because so many men volunteered to go to war that they didn't have enough people to fill the jobs around. And so my mom worked at the airport also, and what Boeing building the great big old B-17s, they would build them in Seattle, and then they'd fly to Cheyenne, and they would land, and at that point, the belly turrets would be installed. And that was the job that my mom had, was to install the belly turrets. An interesting thing, I don't know, it was several years ago, but I heard this sound, and it was actually a B-17 flying over somewhere, and something inside of me, just I could feel it inside. See, when I was infant, they were flying those planes in and out of Cheyenne all day long, every day, and that sound was ingrained in me. And so when I heard that sound of that B-17, which I hadn't heard for years, I could identify that feeling, and that was just kind of interesting. Well, anyway, so my mom was a Rosie the Riveter, and she worked on the B-17s. Well, in 1946, United Airlines transferred my dad from Cheyenne, Wyoming, to Boeing Field in Seattle. And so that's where he worked as a radio technician. And he would also, by the way, this is a big old park, and so there's a lot to look at here. And so he did that, and then on Saturdays, he would go to a place, a little airstrip that it was where the little private planes were kept. And so then he would work on the private planes and work on their radios and tune them up and stuff. Well, one day that airport rented out rides, and so one day this young couple wanted to go for a ride. It's on a Saturday, and they both wanted to sit together in the back. Well, in an airplane, you can't mess with the center of gravity. So he came over and asked my dad if I wanted to go for an airplane ride, and of course I did. So we all piled into the airplane, and we took off, and the guy, after flying a while, the guy said, and by the way, over there in Seattle, it's all, evergreen trees everywhere. We're flying along over some kind of a forest, and he asked me if I wanted to fly, and I said, yeah. And so back then, I wasn't even 10 years old yet. And so I thought, if you're going to turn the plane, you turn the wheel. And that's not how planes work. If you want to turn to the right or left, you use the rudder pedals. So anyway, I decided I would turn, and the next thing you know, out my window is a whole bunch of green trees coming at us. And so he took over, and funny thing is, he never asked my dad if I wanted to go for a ride again after that. But that was my first airplane ride. Well, and my brother, by the way, what we're looking at here is the Queen Creek Wash. And it's man-made, and it's for flood prevention. In the wintertime, on most winters, this fills totally up with water. And so there's still some water left down there at the end. Well, anyway, my brother and I, we grew up flying little model airplanes, and many different times we'd fly them. We'd made them and we bought them, and they had those little Cox thimble drone engines on them, which I think they might still sell. Anyway, so we did that, and then years went by, and I got in high school, and I was going to graduate. And so what I wanted to do, I wanted to go to Bible school because I love Jesus. And so but I needed, to get started, I needed my parents' help, and they refused. They wouldn't send me to a Bible school, but they would send me to a secular college. Well, so anyway, while I was a senior, the Marines sent a recruiter to the school, and he told us that if we went into the Marines when we graduated, they'd train us to be pilots. And boy, that sounded better than going to college to me. So I went home, told my folks that's what I want to do. And then they said, no, you can't do that. By the way, you're going to see a little critter run across the path up here pretty soon. There he goes. And they said, no, you can't do that because you have cavities in your teeth. Now, my wife can tell you that I'm gullible, but I didn't know any difference. And so I thought, well, it's a requirement that you can't have any cavities or something. And so I decided, okay, I guess I'll never fly. And I ended up going to secular college, and my folks were happy, and I got a college education, so all was okay. And then as time went by, I got interested in amateur radio and got real interested in it, got the highest license you could get, and then I also decided, another story there, but I won't tell now. Anyway, I decided I would get my commercial license. So I got my commercial license, and as time went by, and by the way, during that time, my brother was working on his pilot license because he'd been in Air Force ground crew during the Vietnam War, and so when he got out, he got himself a pilot license. And one of the things he did on his first cross-country solo was to come over to see me. He lived in Seattle, and he flew to southeastern Washington to a place called Pasco, which is where I lived. So anyway, he showed me the plane, and I was happy for him and everything like that. And so I was interested in broadcasting, and I ended up working for a church for their Christian radios at their Christian radio station, and just really enjoyed doing that. And the pastor was a pilot. He had a little airplane, and I'd always go out with him to the airport when he needed any electrical work, any electronics or anything like that worked on it. So, because I was qualified to work on it, and my commercial radio license, and by the way, I had the highest you could get back then. So anyway, I worked on his plane, and then one day I was sitting. Oh, by the way, this is the exit. This is the draining end of the Queen Creek, and in the wintertime, the water is just flowing out underneath that bridge and goes on down the creek, and way down there, and about 2/3 of the way across the top, you can see a white line. Well, it's gone now. Anyway, that's another bridge down there, and so the water just flows down this creek, and in the wintertime, and we're going to fly up to the other end. You can see where it comes in. Well, anyway, so where was I? Okay, so sitting in the pastor's office one day, and he said, "Man, you love flying. How come you never got into flying?" And I said, "Well, because I have cavities in my teeth." He was a pretty good-sized guy, and he almost fell out of his chair laughing. And I ignorant old me, I thought, what's so funny? And so my folks had not been honest with me one more time, and so he explained to me that you don't have to worry about that. You have fillings, and so everything is cool. So anyway, he actually told me what I needed to do if I really wanted to get into flying. Now I had a 23-foot sailboat that slept 5 people, had a galley and a head, and it was a pretty nice boat. But I'd been trying to sell it and couldn't sell it. So he said, "Well, you sell that boat and refinance your house and buy an airplane." And so he showed me how to go about that, and I did. He said, "Don't rent an airplane, because if you rent the airplane while you're taking your lessons, you don't have any plane when you're through. If you buy the airplane, take your lessons, then when you're through, you got an airplane to fly. And so, by the way, we're at a higher altitude here because there's no sense trying to fly low because we're practically blinded by the sun. And so he showed me what I needed to do, and I was able to purchase a Cessna 150. And so my brother, he didn't have a plane, so I invited him over to fly, and he and I had 2 or 3 days of wonderful flying together. I let him fly, and my heart was broken because by that time I had over 200 hours, and he was filling out his log one evening, and I looked, and he had about 50 hours. And so anyway, so we had a good time. Then he went home. But as time went by, over the next year, I was able to find another plane down in California that a guy was selling real cheap, that I could actually afford. It was a Cessna 170, which carries 4 people instead of 2. And so I told my brother, I called him up and I said, do you want to go with me down to California, and I'll buy me a Cessna 170, and then you can fly the 150 back and I'll fly the 170 back. And boy, he was happy to do that. So I went over and got him in Seattle, flew back over to Pasco, and we loaded up all the stuff in this little 150. And we literally actually probably had it overloaded. Now, by the way, at this end of the wash, you can see there's a person walking across there, and they're very, very small compared to those great big chunks of concrete. I've been trying to demonstrate that for a long time, and there's a person down there. In the wintertime, when the snow is melting up in the mountains, and when we have monsoon rains, the water comes down that cut right there and flows over those broken pieces of concrete and literally covers them up. And so, let's see, where was I? Okay, so anyway, my brother and I, we flew down to California and got my Cessna 170, and we turned around and flew back, and then we had a lot of fun. And then while we were down there, he found a plane he wanted, and so we flew down again a second time, and so he could pick up his plane because they had one real cheap down there. And so he got himself a plane. We flew back together, and we spent a lot of time flying our planes together whenever we could. Actually, I called us. I don't know if he called us because he's not as much of a nut as I am. But anyway, I called us the Not Quite Right Brothers, and a lot of people understood that. So anyway, we had a lot of fun, and we flew together for lots and lots of hours. I'd fly over to see him, and he'd fly over to see me, and we'd go fly in formation, and that was a lot of fun. And one time we were flying formation, and because he came over to have his plane annual where I had mine done, and as we were flying to the place to get his plane annual, there was some hot air balloons. And so it was a beautiful day, and so too bad we didn't have YouTube back then. But anyway, we got some beautiful pictures of planes flying by, not close, but flying by hot air balloons, because they're beautiful. Well, anyway, so let's see, it would have been about 2004, I had been working at, retirement, because where I worked, they didn't have retirement, and so I pretty much worked until I couldn't work, and I worked at Walmart, and so and I really enjoyed working at Walmart. I got to tell you, that was something I really enjoyed. That was a fun job. Well, anyway, so in 2004, aircraft mechanic really ripped me off, and caused me a whole lot of grief. It cost me a whole lot of money that I didn't need to should not have had to spend. So I decided, okay, if I'm not going to work anymore, I better sell my plane. So my oldest son decided he wanted to buy it, and I remember flying down. He lived down in Oregon, and so the day I flew it down, I remember coming around, and I was coming. In the pattern, and I was coming around to left base, and I was singing the song that Buzz Lightyear sang in Toy Story, and he goes something like, "I shall go sailing no more." And landed that plane at my son's house, and that was the last time I was ever able to fly a full-size plane. That was 2004. Well, so time went by, and about 10 years later, roughly, about 2014, I got interested in drones. Of course, they were coming out with some pretty nice drones back then, and I started out with some that I could just fly in the house, and so I had a lot of crashes and booms and bangs, but I got so I could fly it. And then I was able to purchase a used Phantom 1. They didn't call them Phantom 1, they just called them a Phantom. But anyway, so I was able to get one for a fairly good price. And that was a kind of a plane that you actually did fly visual line of sight, because it would only fly for about 6 minutes, and then the little red light on the back would start blinking, and you had 60 seconds to land. And it would just automatically start landing. So it was definitely a learning experience, but it was nice to have a plane that had GPS, because it actually just stayed in one place pretty much, and you didn't have to fight with it to keep it in the air and keep from running into things. And I even I've got a video. I'll put a link to some videos of my drones, but I've got a link to a video I'll put in the description of when I made my first FPV system, and you had to build your own back then. It didn't come in the drone. And so anyway, I'll put a link to that. And so I flew that, and then when I moved when I moved down to Arizona, I was very active in ham radio until I moved down here, and there was so much RF noise that on my ham radio, I couldn't. I had an S9 signal of noise, so it made it pretty hard. And so I had a couple $1,000s worth of ham gear, which I sold for $500, which was enough to buy in 2016. I bought a Bebop 2, and I flew that, and I had a lot of fun with it, and flew it in this park over and over and over again, and so I really had fun with that. And then one day, my youngest son came by the house with a bag, and he gave it to me, and it was a Mavic 2 Zoom that he had purchased just for me. And that's kind of the end of my flying story, because I've been flying a Mavic Zoom, and then the Mavic Mini, and the Mavic Air 2, which is where this video is being taken. And so I've had a good life of flying. I've really enjoyed it. I've been very blessed. And I want to thank you for watching this video, and God bless you.